asking the court to declare that a embryo is a person and that life begins at conception.
That's what the latest lawsuit filed against university hospitals is asking a judge to decide after 4,000 eggs and embryos were lost in a fertility clinic failure. News 5's Tara Molina learned that suit could mean patients could seek action for wrongful death if their embryos were destroyed. And Tara, you also took this case to a very well-known professor, and this is a person that really knows a lot about this issue.
He sure does, Danita. This is a leading medical ethics expert and health law expert who's a professor at Harvard University. And Glenn Cohen told me there is precedent here, so he has an idea of how this will go. A complex question
is whether or not an embryo is a person.
A judge will now have to answer.
The controversy is whether life begins at conception, therefore making an embryo a person.
Attorney Bruce Taubman is representing UH fertility clinic patient Wendy Penniman and her husband Rick, filing this lawsuit against the hospital because, quote, plaintiffs contend that life begins at conception, meaning that embryos have the legal status of a person. The United States Supreme Court's landmark decision in Roe v. Wade in 1973 held that a fetus is not a person. The definition of fetus begins at conception. There is legal precedent not only in Ohio but across the country that states an embryo is not a person.
That is correct. In Roe versus Wade, the United States Supreme Court held that an embryo is not a person. But that was solely for the purposes of obtaining an abortion.
In 1985, the Ohio Supreme Court held in Whirling versus Sandy that, quote, a viable fetus is a person.
Well, I see this case ending up in front of the Ohio Supreme Court, and I'd like to think that they're going to follow my line of reasoning and declare an embryo a person.
That decision would determine whether or not UH patients can bring a cause of action for wrongful death lawsuits. I brought the case to Glenn Cohen, a Harvard law professor regarded as a leading expert in the world when it comes to medical ethics and health law.
Ohio has already had a case where they basically said you can't use this statute unless you're talking about a viable fetus. And this is so much earlier than that it just seems to me unlikely that they're going to succeed.
Explaining because embryos hadn't been implanted, there is no guarantee they would implant or attach. And even if they did, there is no guarantee they would result in pregnancy or a baby.
People say, when does life begin? But that's actually the wrong way of asking the question, because it's very clear that fetuses are life. The question is whether they are persons. So the very precise question here is whether they are within Ohio's definition of a person for the purposes of its wrongful death statute. And here, based on the existing precedent in Ohio, it seems to be likely the answer will be no. They are not persons within the meaning of that statute.
I also reached out to the Catholic Diocese of Cleveland in reporting this story today, basically revolving around when human life begins, when an embryo becomes a person. They told me they still haven't decided whether or not they're going to comment on the malfunction at UH. If you're interested in reading this lawsuit for yourself, we put it in its entirety up on our News 5 app. Reporting live in Cleveland, Tara Molina, News 5.